Hey book buddies, in this video we will be studying an excerpt from Tyler Miles' debut novel titled Have Mercy. Under fair use, this is intended for educational purposes, of a minimal size to convey the prose, and does not serve as a market substitute. Also, this.
It is July 3rd, 2023. It's the book launch for Have Mercy. This is a book that I started in grad school, but I had the idea way years before that. So what I did is I specifically looked for people who, would be honest with me, and I asked people to be very honest. I'm open to any questions, any critiques, anything. So please feel free to lobby me any questions in my email, on Twitter, here on YouTube. But I'm just really, really happy about this, and I really hope that anybody who picks this book up will enjoy reading it as much as I've enjoyed writing it. Thank you.
The bluest eye meets the ocean at the end of the lane in this magical realism story that offers a unique and captivating journey through a world where reality and fantasy blur. 10-year-old Danae is a biracial girl who has dealt with the loss of her mother and having grown up in the projects, a childhood of poverty. When she comes home from school one day to find her father dead in his bed, she loses her grip on reality and slips into a fantasy world where her dog is a magical knight and monsters are real. As she navigates this new world, she must also find the strength to deal with her father's death and the eccentric and sometimes criminal people entering her life now. With ghosts, witches, and found friendships of the unlikeliest kind, Have Mercy is a magical realism story that delves into themes of race and color, trauma, and the power of imagination. As Danae tries to make sense of what's happening, the reader is left wondering what's real and what's not, and whether Danae can trust herself and the world around her. From a readability standpoint, this 190-word blurb scored a 13.78 on the Flesch-Kincaid grade level, which places it at college level. At the top, we see the book is described as The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison meets The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. Truth be told, I have not read both these books at the time of this recording, and if any part of the book were to resemble these references, it would be lost on me. If anyone could point them out to me in the comments, it would help me to appreciate this book. My thanks in advance. Before we move on, some thoughts on the blurb. This line and a half, 42 words, I think is doing too much. It gives her age, her race, her emotional baggage, and her economic status, which, dealt with, suggests that she no longer has a childhood of poverty. Before we get to the plot, consider this quick revision. Returning to her home in the projects of Philadelphia, 10-year-old Danae finds her father dead in his bed. What is lost other than 24 words? The cost of these 18 words are her biraciality and the prior loss of her mother. The blurb is one way how you market your book, and it's best to appeal to your target audience. Look at the start of the second paragraph. I find this blunt. The themes are race and color, loss and grief, and the power of imagination. So our revision does not meet the first on race and color. It does meet with loss and grief of the father, and it does meet the third with how she copes, as illustrated with the cover and talk of a fantasy world. I say I find this blunt because, out of context, if someone were to say it's about race and color, loss and grief, and the power of imagination, I would think it was a review. Not a blurb, but a review. Like the shoe was on the other foot. I would prefer if instead of telling us about the story, it tells us the story in so few words, or keep it separate. The last sentence of both paragraphs also. They seem similar. I would pick the first. Now let's look at the blurb again. Returning to her home in the projects of Philadelphia, 10-year-old Danae finds her father dead in his bed. She loses her grip on reality and slips into a fantasy where her dog Dart is a magical knight and monsters are real. As she navigates this new world with ghosts, witches, and found friendships of the unlikeliest kind, Danae must find the strength to deal with her father's death and the eccentric, sometimes criminal people entering her life now. The bluest eye meets the ocean at the end of the lane in this gritty, magical realism story that delves into themes of race and color, loss and grief, and the power of imagination. 190 words, down to 112. That's 78 words, or 41%, trimmed. Don't tell her what happened, okay? It's bad enough her loudmouth grandma already told my baby girl what happened to her mom. Now I'm dead as dead, too, but still warm, I'd imagine. It's early, that time in the morning when everything is blue, when the sun crests the points of the skyscrapers downtown, or shudders crust from its red eyes. The time when kids who take the bus are already at school having free breakfast. You'll know my baby when you see her. She's got that sunflower color mixed children get when they don't always darken like bodega Wonder Bread in the toaster. Instead, they golden like wheat under the sun. Before I took too many pills, drank a little bit too much, and got my ass dead, I had to get on her about her dog. Had to tell her that last time was the last time. He won't do it again, she said. I promise. Her seriousness took stark contrast to that small, soft face. A face that held no lines on it yet. Only tiny, dark eyes like sunflower seeds set firmly in her radiant, round face. You told me that last time, Danae, I argued. We're not doing this again. That damn dog's a problem and he needs to go. My words cracked her harder than my hands ever had. Tears welled in her softening eyes, her mom's eyes, and that bottom lip, the only one with any meat on it at all, trembled until two buck teeth bit down to steady it. I don't think it was intentional, but her left hand fell to her side and bloomed slowly open. Almost immediately, Dart lopped over from his sunspot, the square of light that glided across the carpet with the sun's movement in the sky, and nudged her palm with his nose until she pet him. Dart would lay on those sunspots as if personally offered its warmth and comfort by the sky. When they slid out from under him during sleep, he'd meander to a new spot and spin until the world was right, then collapse again into dreams. We both looked down at him. I did my best to keep serious and keep my chest puffed out, but I couldn't deny the damn dog was cute. He sat there with his head tipped to the side, eyes shut, and tongue lolling stupidly. His back foot faintly kicked as he leaned into a good head scratch from Danae. My laughter surprised us both. I remember how it startled her, and how, as if my bouncing belly was permission, she too began to laugh. That was my favorite sound, my baby's laughter. Honey smooth, then warm and bubbling, like peaches in a cobbler, or maybe like the catfish grease her grandma kept in that old cast iron pan in the oven. Anything cooked in that pan came out sprinkled with black iron chips and the taste of nickels, including the grease she kept in there for God knows how long. That was the first 505 words of the book, and I thought it was pretty clean. There are a few points I would like to discuss. It's early, the time in the morning when everything is blue, when the sun crests the points of the skyscrapers downtown, or shudders crust from its red eyes. Shudders. This is more to do with imagery, but to shudder is like to shiver itself or to shake. And does the sun wobble itself in the sky? The sun is also likened to red eyes, plural. Do eyes shudder themselves? Maybe here the better word would be shudders. You'll know my baby when you see her. She has got that sunflower color mixed children get, where they don't always darken like bodega Wonder Bread. Where? This where is particular because we're talking about the color of Danae's skin. And if she were born in the city, if she were born in the country, or any place for that matter, would her color change? I would say no. Points in time are a lot harder to test, so maybe the better word here would be when. Before I took too many pills, drank a little bit too much, and got my ass dead, I had to get on her about her dog. This sentence, look at this sentence. We just got the time established. It's early morning. And now the father is dead, but not cold. And we're talking about his last regret. In the same paragraph, it's in present tense, and then past tense. Then we have a speech from Danae later on. He won't do it again, and I promise. To wrap up, it calls back to his daughter's face being like a sunflower. Look, this paragraph is skipping around to get the sunflower image to work, but it reads clunky to me. What if we take this line and pair it with the opening lines because the father's death isn't mentioned in the rest of the parts that follow? My words cracked her harder than my hands ever had. Ever had. I wanted to point this out because it's a bit of characterization for the father. Not only does he love his daughter, which is Not too surprising. But he has a drug problem and beats her. This is interesting. Again, good characterization. I don't think it was intentional, but her left hand fell to her side and bloomed slowly open. The bloomed slowly open. Slowly, being an adverb, modifies a verb. This is something to keep in mind for me because the father is narrating. This is in first person, so I'm curious to see if this is specific to him, a stylized choice of words, or worst case, just a one off awkward phrasing. Almost immediately. Not immediately, but almost immediately. I don't know what the almost adds in this sentence. Dart would lay on those sunspots as if offered its warmth and comfort by the sky. When they slid out from under him during sleep, it meandered to a new spot. This is an imagery issue. When they slid out from under him. These sunspots are described as something offered to Dart the dog, so why do they slide out from under him? What if instead it mentions how Dart is greedy for these sunspots? That would make sense to me. My laughter surprised us both. I remember how it startled her. These two do not pair well. My laughter is in the active voice. Then it switches to, I remember how it startled her. Why not simply say, it startled her? I remember is a use of character filtering, which is to say that this is the character experience. It is possible that whatever follows may not be true. He remembered it, or he might have misremembered it. I mean, the father is dead as dead. I would assume that the entire portion is to the best of his ability, so the remember is redundant. And how, as if my bouncing belly was permission. This was acts as a suppositional, so instead of was, were would be more appropriate. Anything cooked in that pan came out sprinkled with black iron chips and the taste of nickels, including the grease she kept in there for God knows how long. This cast iron pan gets a mention from the catfish grease, which is how the father describes Danae's laughter. Why? Why are we talking about this cast iron pan? The dog was cute, I laughed, she laughed, cast iron pan. This is, well, not the proper term, but I want to call it a non sequitur. Maybe extraneous is the better term, but we'll just leave this here for now. I thought this story was going to be about a little girl, and the first 500 words are really about the father. But chapter 1 is coming up, so let's do this again with the first 500 words proper. Danae was always first to class to avoid this very thing, the staring, sniggering, and hushed jokes other kids whispered as she walked stiffly to her seat in the back of the classroom. She watched out for feet stuck too far out in the aisle. It wasn't that she was ugly. In fact, the boys, Hollis, Michael, Jeremy, used to give her the same looks they'd give the other girls they bothered with during recess. Back in first grade, Danae clammed up any time Mrs. Harper called on her. She nearly suffocated from the attention. First, her throat would tighten. Then her ears rang. Her vision got fuzzy, and her stomach hurt like she was hungry, even if she had breakfast that day. Most teachers noticed her silent panic, and it was rare now that any of them called on her. Between her severe shyness and how it riled up the rest of the class, they just left her alone. That's why Danae sat in the back shadows of the bright classroom. She slumped in her seat, her face shielded by an upright textbook, which happened to be hiding her new favorite library book. She was racing through The Last Night, trying to reread it before the due date later that week. Danae wanted nothing more than to escape into those magical pages. She felt safe in a world where knights fight monsters, a world of magical lakes and impregnable castles, enchanted weapons and sneaky rogues. If she couldn't live there in real life, she could at least live there for the first few minutes of class, as Mrs. Knoll hushed the other kids, and the spectacle of her presence wore off. Slowly, the embarrassment washed away, and the pain whirlpooled from under her nose. She could finally focus while Mrs. Knoll bored the bullies with that day's lesson. Despite her anxiety, Mrs. Knoll's English class was Danae's favorite period of the day. Once, after the room had nearly cleared out, Mrs. Knoll walked back to Danae's desk. She had noticed her advanced reading skills. Danae looked at her sneakers and smiled knowingly. Mrs. Noel suggested that she might even be the best reader in class, though she couldn't be sure since Danae kept so quiet. Dropping her smile like a worm-eaten apple, Danae looked up and excused herself from the classroom. Since then, Mrs. Noel was nice enough to not call on her anymore. Danae knew she could read just fine, better than any of the other kids, even without Mrs. Noel's assurance. She wondered if she was a better reader than Mrs. Noel herself. Some days it seemed like her teacher couldn't get through a paragraph without wheezing and coughing into a handkerchief, which many of the kids noted was the same handkerchief she used since the first day of school. Still, the few times she had read aloud, Danae remembered freezing up. She felt as though her throat was made of blown glass, and every word risked shattering her from the inside out. That was the first 505 words of the story proper, and it's different. It's told in the third person past tense, and that puts more distance between the narrator and the reader. Let's look at the first line. Danae was always the first to class to avoid this very thing, the staring, sniggering, and hushed jokes other kids whispered as she walked stiffly to her seat in the back of the classroom. The sentence is long, and there is quite a bit of telling. Danae was always the first to class. Well, why isn't she today? In the prologue, her father's perspective, which we didn't read all the way, ends with his mother, Danae's grandmother, coming over to make sure she gets on the school bus because she thinks whenever the driver sees them a block away from their stop, drives off. And this is not the first time it's happened. So, multiple times, Danae misses the bus, but how is she always the first to class? Maybe it's midday and she was late for this one class? I don't know. I also don't know what the staring or sniggering is about, but the hush jokes, that's the most important one to expand upon, and we don't get that here. For this line, it starts, Danae is always the first to class, and ends with, she walked stiffly to her seat in the back of the room, which is repetitive. The second, third, and fourth line. She watched out for feet stuck too far out in the aisles. It wasn't that she was ugly. In fact, the boys, Hollis, Michael, Jeremy, used to give her the same looks they'd give the other girls they bothered with during recess. Used to? They still do. The second line, it wasn't that she was ugly. Well, what was it then? Do the boys bother all the girls equally or only the attractive ones? Do the boys have a type? For the rest of the paragraph, and for the next one as well, there's no use of the boys, so I'm not sure if they're relevant right here, right now. Back in first grade, Danae clammed up any time Mrs. Harper called on her. She nearly suffocated from the attention. So right now, Danae is 11 years old. She should be in either 5th or 6th grade. She's late for class, and we're talking about her experience in the first grade. This is similar to the prologue where the father establishes it's early morning and talks about the time before he took too much. It's jarring. Between her severe shyness and how it riled up the rest of the class, they just left her alone. Did they? Danae gets stared at, sniggered at, and joked at. Is she really being left alone when she has to beware legs stuck out in the aisles? Maybe the teachers don't engage her, but the class does. This needs a little work for clarity or consistency. That's why Danae sat in the back shadows of the bright classroom. This is telling, and perhaps the one line I'd like to see changed the most. That's why Danae sits in the back of the class. Not because of some coincidence of her name in alphabetical order, or that the teacher moved her there out of pity and or consideration, but because she was shy. Do all the shy kids go to the back? Are all the misfits in there, or could there be a regular kid? It's a reason that doesn't make sense to me, but again, this is telling. I am told, and it would be better if I was shown to make that conclusion myself. She slumped in her seat, her face shielded by an upright textbook. This can be possibly read as she had her book in front of her as she slumped. If so, how did she look out for those feet stuck too far out in the aisles? If sequentially, she slumped in her seat and shielded her face. This construction, as is, can be cleaned up. If she couldn't live there in real life, she could at least live there for the first few minutes of class as Mrs. Knoll hushed the other kids and the spectacle of her presence wore off. I want to say this borders on a run on sentence, but anyway, this and the next. Slowly, the embarrassment washed away and the pain whirlpooled from under her nose. Did she have a panic attack just walking to class and taking her seat? What embarrassment washed away? What is embarrassment? Embarrassment is something that happened and then you want to take it back. Let's say she walks into class and farts. Really let one rip, unironically, of course. Yeah, it's embarrassing. So what happened? Is the spectacle just her being her? Despite her anxiety, Mrs. Knoll's English class was Danae's favorite period of the day. What does of the day do for this sentence? Compare it to was her favorite period. Of the day is a qualifier. If this was yesterday, her favorite could have been math. Are we going to talk about her other favorites? Because if not, this is superfluous. Once, after the room nearly cleared out, Mrs. Knoll walked back to Danae's desk. She had noticed her advanced reading skills. My question is, how? Obviously, this is telling, but how does Mrs. Knoll do it? Is it something like this?
You're reading Gravity's Rainbow? Rereading.
I get the feeling this is making Danae out to be not like other girls because she reads. Mrs. Knoll was nice enough to not call on her anymore. To not call is a split infinitive. She wondered if she was a better reader than Mrs. Knoll herself. This is a suppositional, so were. Some days, it seemed like her teacher couldn't get through a paragraph without wheezing and coughing into a handkerchief, which many of the kids noted was the same handkerchief she used since the first day of school. Now, is this part supposed to be ironic? You have Danae with advanced reading skills, even better than Mrs. Knoll herself, yet Mrs. Knoll can't get through a paragraph without wheezing and coughing. Is the, let's call it talent, reading comprehension level or reading out loud? It's confusing. I'm confused. Which many of the kids noted was the same handkerchief. This part I find extraneous. In the same paragraph, the word which is used with the upright textbook, which happened to be hiding her new favorite library book. It's just too much. And for the last line of the paragraph, it says, she felt as though her throat was made of blown glass, and every word risked shattering her from the inside out. We already got the panics from first grade with Mrs. Harper, so this we already know. It's repetitive. That was the first 500 words proper from the book Have Mercy, and the difference between the prologue and chapter 1 are significant. However, the 2 and the blurb are close in that you can tell it was written by the same author. One of the commonalities I noticed was the wordiness. For the read-alongs, it's important to interpret the prose without messing up the read, so this one took a few takes. I say it's wordy because it also feels indulgent. Sentences go long. The prologue at 190 words, trimmed to 112 words, I feel retained most of what it needed. Chapter 1, the first paragraph is 159 words, and the second paragraph is 346 words. It's just 2 paragraphs. 2, which is dense to me. It throws all this stuff at you, and at the end, that's why so-and-so. Danae is not in school long after the introduction and hurries home to her father and dog. So, was the school necessary? I ask this question a lot, and as a writer myself and when editing, if you write for an audience, you have to ask. What's the advice? Kill your darlings. This is our author's debut novel that he started in grad school, but he had the idea years before. I wonder how his next book will turn out. My thanks to Tyler Miles for making this video possible. Check him out in the description for a link to his website and the link to purchase Have Mercy. I hope this was fun, informative, and it would make me happy if anyone learned anything from this study. Please keep in mind that thoughts on a book are highly subjective, and if you take to the comments, please keep it respectful. Like and subscribe while you're there. I read through to the end of the prologue, to the end of the sample, and I have the Kindle version. So if folks want me to continue, let me know. That's all for now. Thank you for watching.